true freedom comes from boundaries, but only when you set the boundaries. So you become conscious of it, right? You can't just run around naked around the city or whatever, but when you choose to take it off, then you can feel very, very free.
Spread Great Ideas is meant to increase the signal in a world awash in noise. I'm your curator and host, Brian David Crane, and it is my quest to share the learnings of the world's most interesting people, the disruptors, the outliers, the libertines, and those who've been unconventionally successful so that we can become a little bit wiser together. I'm pleased to welcome my dear friend David Newell to the show. David wears many hats. He's a writer, philosopher, consigliere, and more. He knows more about myths, the collective unconscious, and Carl Jung's works than anyone I know. And as he put it, the meaning and morality of one's life comes from within oneself. Healthy, strong individuals seek self-expansion by experimenting and by living dangerously. So, thanks for coming on the show, David.
Pleasure.
To start with, what is a myth and why should we care about them?
I think a myth could best be described as almost a unit of consciousness. There's this idea in the I Ching, in the Taoist philosophy, that consciousness learns through impact. So there is a being is then interrupted by an event, and the being responds to that event in some way. And if you think about the nature of story, that's always what's happening, right? There is a person, a protagonist, moving through time and space, and an event must happening. And indeed, in fiction, we always say one of the golden rules of writing is always be escalating. You can't have a story that just goes flat for so long. And so a myth is the very first, the earliest example of humans' attempts to describe learnings of their consciousness through time. And so you can imagine that sitting around sharing stories of learnings was the earliest form of information and intelligence exchange. And these myths that have come up have essentially informed the deepest truths about human consciousness that we have. And what's interesting about them, and I think what kind of revolutionized Jung's work and latterly Joseph Campbell's work, is that similar stories, similar myths, similar motifs would appear in all of these different indigenous societies from all different parts of the world in different timelines, with incredible similarities, which led Jung to posit that there was some sort of deeper collective repository of wisdom that all of us had access to. And that was the kind of birth of his concept of archetypes and the collective unconscious.
And what it, like when you say this, that there was myths across indigenous cultures, like give me an example of one, a myth of good and evil, or a myth of what is one of these stories that seems to have been conveyed across different cultures?
Well, a classic one that we would know in Europe would be Cinderella. And obviously that's been turned into Disney. Well, a lot of Disney stories have come from myths, but there are many, many, many different cross parallels for that. The Sumerian version of that, which is one of the oldest myths ever, is the myth of Inanna. And that's the myth of two sisters, Inanna and Eshragul. And Eshragul is the queen of hell, and or the underworld, as it's called in that myth. And Inanna wants to go see her, and in order to go see her, she must descend through 7 gates, and at each gate taking off each one of clothes until she gets to the bottom of the 7th gate and meets her sister, who, out of envy, hangs her up and kills her. And then the townspeople are so concerned that they send people after her to gather her remains, and then she's rebirthed and comes back into the world. And it's the oldest myth we have of this concept of going into the underworld and dying and being reborn.
Mm.
And the parallels to Cinderella are that she is, of course, one of several sisters. She's fallen, if you like. She's the one that's picked on. She's made to kind of roam through the houses and so forth and clean everything. And she's the last person that you would expect to go through this rebirthing experience. And she, through fate and fortune, finds her way to this ball and puts on the glass slipper, and that's the thing that redeems her basically and transforms her and allows this rebirth story. And Cinderella, Cinder is this concept of ashes, from death, from fire, she is reborn again. And there's lots of different derivations of this same myth around. That's the most prominent one that comes to mind.
And do you see myths nowadays in the 21st century as useful? And that's a really bad way to describe it. But what I mean by the question is that, you and I would not, we're both, guys in our 30s and 40s, would not necessarily talk about Cinderella, right? You would talk about it with kids or something, but like what is why is it still useful nowadays in terms of being able to understand the world as adults?
That's a great one. So I think one of the things that we learn as adults or have to relearn, we're taught as children the concept of boundaries, right? Everybody goes through the kind of toddler era. You have a young one at the moment where you're instrumental in doing this, right? And alive in her at the moment is this Mars archetype, this kind of testing of boundaries. Aries is the archetype of war, just wants to blaze through everything with anger and fire and passion. And that is what toddlers are doing at that age. And of course, they don't yet have access to a psychic framework that can hold those archetypal energies, which is why they're just madness, right? That's coming through them. And it's the responsibility of the parents or the caregivers to mediate that archetypal energy that's pouring through them and say, no, it's not okay to throw, the spoon across the kitchen or whatever. And funnily enough, we re-go through this in adult life as we come out of what's essentially our parents' value system. That is enforced and has to be there in order for us to be sort of acculturated and civilized in society. We've all had that experience in our 20s and 30s where we see other people doing stuff that we feel uncomfortable with. And if we do enough self-inquiry, we realize that actually we don't really believe that stuff, or we do, but it's our conditioning that's made us there. It's our parents have said, no, you know what, maybe you shouldn't run around naked, at the swimming pool or whatever, when other people who maybe were raised in more hippie type families are perfectly comfortable with it. And you realize once you take your clothes off and jump in that, the whole idea of being ashamed of your nakedness is a bit ridiculous. It's a civilized shame, right? And this battle but of course we do need boundaries. So what you're doing in adulthood is learning this rather wonderful lesson of true discipline, true freedom comes from boundaries, but only when you set the boundaries. So you become conscious of it, right? You can't just run around naked around the city or whatever, but when you choose to take it off, then you can feel very, very free. And so where this applies in myth is this concept. And so in astrology, if we borrow from the archetypes there, you would have the myth of Uranus, which is chaos, is the archetype of chaos. And then you'd have Saturn, which is the archetype of time and boundaries. And these two are essentially at war with each other. And Saturn, Kronos, castrated Uranus. And so
but explain that Saturn castrated Uranus by cutting Uranus's testicles and throwing them in the water.
Correct, which then birthed Venus, Aphrodite.
Yeah. Okay,
cool. What's important about putting these ideas in mythic form is realizing that they need containment and that they're and that you can't be all of one thing. And some folks might think, why do I need to conceptualize of such raw energies in these stories? And this is the heart of like why myth is actually useful. And I'll give you a good example of this. I live in Bali, and there's lots of people there going through crises, personal development crises, trying to understand things and so forth. And there's a friend of mine, a Russian guy, a true artist. You know, his mindset towards everything was just kind of like, screw it, like I want to play and just be free and blah blah blah. And he had 2 children and a wife there, and they had kind of fled from the Ukraine conflict, and they were in Bali, and he was essentially going through, you know, a midlife crisis where, funnily enough, that's when the Uranus in your chart comes online at 41, 42. It's called a Uranus opposition. So his psyche was exploding with this energy. And, you know, this is where people go out and commit adultery, drive sports cars, insert middle-aged cliche here. And his version of it was very interesting. It was an unrestrained desire to just do dance every single day, which is very popular in Uber, ecstatic dance, contact dance, and so forth. This kind of 41-year-old man. Meanwhile, his financial position was absolutely like going through the floor. I mean, way in debt, you know, people after him, business issues. And we were in circle together, and he would share about these things. And it was quite challenging for us to listen to, knowing that he had two young children to feed, right? This kind of sense of responsibility. Where are you taking the responsibility? And, you know, I would share with him basically like the archetypal struggle that was like playing out for him, between this Uranus energy that comes through and this Saturn. Money is a classic component of Saturn, right? Nothing will make you take responsibility more than not having any money anymore. And yeah, it was interesting to share with him that like these energies, these titanic energies in myth, always end in disaster. If you do too much of boundary, or if you do too much of freedom, you're going to end up polarizing to one of the extremes, and we see disaster. So I think it's very useful to have a kind of a mythopoetic framework underneath some of these bigger things, because it really puts a frame around the chaos that can unfold even in adult life, that necessarily happens in like adolescence, but doesn't necessarily need to happen in adult life.
It's interesting you use the word chaos, because Jordan Peterson talks a lot about order and chaos. Is that the two, Saturn and Uranus?
You could think, yeah, so
yeah.
there's so many different archetypal languages or lenses from which to draw those things. But yes, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So then, as you're talking to this friend of yours in circle, he's going through all this. Do you ever sit there and go, well, how do I say this? Like, I am projecting onto him my own value set. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm personally,
and I wanted to get into like moral relativism, because that's also the I think, to me, the way I understand myths is a lot of times is a way to convey stories that teach morality, or these like guidebooks, let's say, right? Like practical philosophy,
yeah,
and you do it in a way that is easy to understand, and that it it has stood the test of time, which is why you see these myths that are replicable across different cultures. It's like, we know that these things are the ways
yeah,
that like there's a reason that like envy, Cain and Abel, like the stories, like the story of Abraham, the ones that Jordan Peterson talks about from the Bible, are such that they draw on universal truths. We'll say, right?
yeah. I mean, that idea about am I projecting?
Yeah.
Is a great one, and projection is actually incredibly useful. And having these situations and people around you where they're describing these events is incredibly helpful, because in my view, all life is a stage. We're almost all walking around in a Shakespearean comedy or tragedy, whichever mood you're in that day. And I I see through the lens of life where anyone that comes in that brings in a story or an experience that's going on in their life at the moment that I then have a particular judgment or a charge about, that is something of value to me. That's usually indicative, it's symbolic of something that's happening for me. And I always say, like, once is happenstance, two is I don't believe in coincidence, but we'll call it coincidence, and three is something you got to look at. And so if like two or three people are bringing in archetypal themes, they may have differing stories. It's easier when their stories or the situations are quite similar, because then your logical mind can kind of like, we'll be like, oh yeah, two people are saying the same thing. What does this mean, type thing. But once you know the deeper language of archetype, you can recognize the tensions, the same tensions coming up in different settings and stories. Then I think, oh, okay, why is this coming up? There's clearly something that I'm not looking at about boundaries and freedom that's going on for me right now. And time and again, it doesn't take very long for some self-inquiry to indicate what that is. And that's when you're really in this like really profound, beautiful, like mythopoetic dance with the invisible realms. And it's kind of what Jung led Jung to posit the idea of synchronicity.
What does that mean, the idea of synchronicity?
Well, the famous example of when he first came up with it was that he was in analysis with a patient of his in Switzerland, and the the person being analyzed was describing a beetle that was in her dream, and it was a scarab beetle, which is quite an unusual type of beetle to find. And at the point that Jung was contemplating it, he sort of got up and walked over to the window, and a scarab beetle appeared at that moment right on the side of the glass, just as he was contemplating, like, what is the importance of this? And it led him to believe that there is a strong force, an invisible force, if you like, that's guiding events from an invisible psychic realm that we can't see, that's connected with our thoughts.
That's beyond the realm of science.
That's beyond the realms of science, yeah. And what's funny about that is I'm probably going to butcher the name, but there's a very famous physicist that came along maybe 10 or 20 years into Jung's work called Wolfgang Pauli. I think it's him. And this was around the time that kind of quantum physics was really taking off, and this idea of there being an invisible field, a void, a quantum field that was out there. It's obviously just following Einstein's theory of relativity. And so the things like the concept of the observer effect was taking fold. And Jung and Pauli had a very profound and powerful professional collaboration in like the last third of his professional life, where essentially Pauli was trying to find in science, in quantum physics, a scientific backing for Jung's positing of synchronicity. And they came, as close as one can do to trying to prove these things, but at least showing that consciousness affects consciousness, and that there's something going on between a human being paying attention and shaping the field beyond them. And then from that place, we end up with decades of New Age manifestation philosophy, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. But yeah.
Is that the same concept as Schrodinger's cat?
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, that's the one where they it's a philosophical exercise, from what I understand, that says inside this cat, there's a cat inside this box, and you're asking the person if they believe that it's dead or not, and that when they open the box, it is whatever the state of the cat is, whatever the person like believed it to be, and that prior to ever opening the box, it was in sort of it wasn't defined. Like,
yeah, understood.
And I'm doing a bad way of explaining that, but it touches on this as well, which is the observer effect.
Yeah, there's very similar parallels to it.
Yeah. You had talked in the car prior to this podcast about Carl Jung and his journey let's say, back to Christ consciousness
Yeah.
or to Christ consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain that term and then also his journey to that, where he got to later in his life?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jung's idea, or one of many of them, but one of the central ideas of Jungian psychology is this concept of the self. Self with a big S. It's not the self of the ego self that we kind of commonly identify with, as ourselves and our persona, our personality. The self, as he saw it, was a central organizing force that lies deep within our consciousness that is constantly looking for unity, harmony, and integration of opposites within our psyche. It's what could be considered our soul, or is described by our soul in other different modalities or ways of thinking. And he became very naturally incredibly fascinated with understanding what this self really was. He knew that there was something way beyond the ego, which I think a lot of psychologists had already kind of thought at that time, certainly Freud, and but was very keen to understand what the nature of was it, what the nature was of it. And dreams were his medium, if you like, his portal to trying to understand the unconscious and trying to understand. He was like, what is actually dreaming? Because it's not my ego dreaming. Like, who is this person dreaming, and who is the person coming up? What is the thing coming up with these dreams, and why is it that these dreams seem to have symbolic information and intelligence that, if I follow and unpack, has enormously beneficial insights
Yeah.
and improvements in my life. And so that became like a profound lifelong confrontation for him, where he then very famously, I think it was in like 1913 or so, just before the outbreak of World War II, he had this famous kind of confrontation with his unconscious, where he basically voluntarily drove himself to madness by descending fully into his unconscious through, several months worth of unpacking of dreams and going deeper and deeper and deeper, and allowing himself to go into what he called a divine madness, the kind of things that you read about in like very old prophetic, type of biblical scripture and so on. These mystics that kind of sit out in the deserts and just go a bit crazy on God. He essentially did a very thoughtful, pre-planned version of that, and then wrote about it every single day, the dreams he was having and the analysis that he was having. And what
a fascinating experiment.
what he started to discover as he was going slowly mad, was firstly, there's a lot of value in going mad, because if you want to actually understand, it's a bit like taking psychedelics, right? Like, don't expect to not be surprised, because the point of psychedelics is to reveal your unconscious. So if you're going to have a confrontation with your unconscious, expect to be surprised. It's not going to come from a framework of sanity. It's going to come from a place of insanity and madness. So there is true genius in madness, if you can contain it. Anyway, so what he basically started to understand was that the self that was appearing in his dreams was a child. It was a divine, innocent child, and it was him, age 5, 6, or 7, and this child really was the 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 most soulful piece of him that was essentially guiding him along. And if you think about his idea of like, you always have to integrate your opposite, as an adult, the way to get back to your happiest place is to go towards childhood. So it's quite funny. I mean, there's that classic like line in the Bible, right? Jesus would say, until you become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's a little bit of a sneak peek as to where he starts moving towards the idea of Christ. So this child, this like virginal, very innocent child, would speak to him, and it would basically say that he was disconnected from like really important parts of himself, parts of play, parts of things that would make, his childlike part very happy. And so he would, again, as part of this process of going slowly mad, he was like, building little rock forts and castles at his house, completely sort of upended his family, just let his wife deal with the kids, while he just kind of essentially regressed back to becoming like a 7 or 8 year old. And by doing so, he managed to kind of go back through, some pretty profound trauma. And of course, this was way before people even thought about the idea of trauma, way before they had any conception stuff. He's just like wading back through pretty hardcore, like, childhood memories of like, massive alienation and depression and, confrontations with his parents and so forth, all to just try and get to this place of unification with this divine child. And what he realized in this process is, children at that age, they don't really have an ego. But of course, if you're like at his age, 35-year-old guy that's already basically become one of, if not the most important person in psychology ever, you're going to develop quite a sense of yourself. But of course, his thirst for knowledge and for advancement of discovery of human consciousness way outweighed that. And so this child part of him was just essentially making him do things that would humble or humiliate, his ego. And he wrote something really fascinating in the Red Book, actually, where he basically wrote like the path to salvation is not through the hero. This idea that like we have nowadays, and that's like, in my opinion, like the biggest modern malaise we have, that just by going out into the world and conquering it and achieving a performance and the hero's journey and so forth, which there is a value in that, but that's not going to lead to any kind of unification with the self. And that's why we just end up in this perpetual hamster wheel of people, attempting to achieve and then needing to fill, needing to set the other goal. And then you have the people blathering on about how it's the journey, not the goal. And actually, I don't think it's either of those things. I mean, it's definitely more the journey than the goal, but he would say that the redemption of the soul is not through the hero, but through the savior, through Christ, through love, and through being a service. So nothing to do with the ego, nothing to do with the great I, going way beyond that. And so that's when we kind of birth on the shores of sort of Christ consciousness, and this idea that the biggest problem that there exists around Christianity is, and I'm going to probably get murdered for blasphemy here, is the idea that like the Christ myth or the Bible is a literal story, and this idea that Christians tend to hang on to, that a guy did actually exist 2,000 years ago and died and be reborn. And to be honest with you, even if he did, it doesn't matter, because the truth is way more powerful as a myth, as a psychological, as a meta narrative, as a journey of the soul, the undying soul, as that it is with the body. And so in the sense that when you understand it and sit with the crucifixion and the rebirth and the story of Jesus as a soul map, and as a journey of consciousness, and what every single person is capable of doing, i.e. dying to your bullshit, dying to your ego, dying to your selfishness, your greed, your gluttony, your jealousy, the 7 deadly sins, and rebirthing in love and in service to others and in kindness and in those kind of classic Christian teachings, that is available to everyone. And what the myth of Jesus and Christ is meant to say is exactly that, is to let go of these egoic forms of relating that are necessary to make passage through the first half of life, but are not at all appropriate for the second half of life, where we really should be just being in service to others. And that is paradoxically where we find the most happiness. And so, Christ consciousness is this concept of making Jesus not a savior to look up to, which is what happens when you literalize him, but when you take it into metaphor, realize that you can embody Christ yourself. That's available. And the purpose of the story and the reason he came was to show that that's what you're supposed to do. So it all suddenly becomes like, it all suddenly makes so much more sense when you look at it from a soulful, mythical standpoint versus a literal one where your mind is just getting stuck in trying to understand how on earth this could be possible.
And the last part you touched on there, is that the golden rule, or to do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself, that was a revolutionary idea, way of being, way of acting in the world, in the sense of it took the rules and it upended them, and it basically said it's self-referential.
Yep.
How would I like to be treated by
Yep.
you? So therefore, I should do that to you, and vice versa, right?
And the funny thing is that speaks to like one of the deepest and uncomfortable truths. And I think if you have a psychedelic experience or a mystical experience, you realize that you're not really like this kind of flesh puppet that's walking around for 70 or 80 or 90 years. Like, we're all essentially this sort of infinite spark of awareness. And this is in every single, monotheistic religion, as well as in Buddhism and Taoism. We're kind of just staring out essentially at ourselves, like a giant mirror of ourselves. And so this Christian edict of sort of love thy neighbor is essentially saying love what you're looking at in the mirror, because it is actually you.
Well, the whole thing is love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the actual
Exactly.
phrasing,
Yeah. And the funny thing is, it's the same thing.
Hmm.
It is actually the same thing. And anyone that's taken acid or mushrooms, whatever else, will get that pretty fast. You are just walking around, staring at a refracted version of yourself, back at yourself. All of your judgments about other people are just judgments about yourself.
What do you think, though, about the first part of the, like, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, like like the actions towards somebody else, right? Like,
I
not only
think
seeing
it's just the same. It's just the physical extension of the same thing. I mean, we are. Let's be real here. We can get all kind of like meta wanky and in our heads about it, but we are in physical bodies, right? If you reach across here and hit me in the face, it's gonna hurt. And so, like, you need a physical teaching. We're 50% earthly, we're 50% spiritual, and so you need a right teaching for thinking, and you need a right teaching for doing. Because I think, like, I had an old spiritual teacher who had a funny phrase. He would say that spirituality is about getting an STD, saying, thinking, and doing in truth. When you get all those in alignment, that's when you're in harmony. And a lot of the time, we're incoherent and we suffer is what we say and we think and we do are actually not in coherence with each other.
And that's kind of the definition of being of psychosis, right? Or where your parts don't align.
Yeah, and I think we're all in it, definitely. Like, I think that we're all this conflagration, this symphony of parts. And this is like, a lot of people nowadays, a very popular form of therapy is like constellation therapy or parts-based therapy. And I think it's really, really useful to dialogue with all these different kind of refractionated parts of ourselves: the inner child, the protector, the achiever, all these different parts that split off, because every single person on earth has experienced trauma, little t trauma, for the most part, thankfully. And we've all become like cut off into different parts. Everybody experiences like minor levels of disassociation, and these different parts coming into union is the journey of coming into wholeness.
Of getting an STD.
Yeah. And I mean, religion literally means to unite. So it is to unite. Yoga is to yoke, is to unite. Like, all of these different spiritual forms are trying to bring into integration, into wholeness. That's why Jung was so onto something with the concept of the self. Like, there's this constant attempt to keep trying to bring the spirit and the soul into harmony.
You had said in the past, not during this conversation, that this, when the soul experiences trauma early on, that it goes unconscious.
Yeah.
Can you expand a bit more on that?
Yeah.
And how it ties in with Jung?
Yeah. Yeah, it gets really fascinating. So, I'll speak a little bit about like developmental trauma. So in an ideal world, when a child is born, a baby is born, for the first 2 to 3 years, they have a primary caregiver that is holding them and co-regulating their experience of the physical realm that they're in, which is ultimately very overwhelming to them, and helping them mediate what's called affect in psychological terms. Affect is essentially sensation and contact with the physical world. Okay. Not just physical, but emotional, but any kind of stimulation that comes in from the earthly surroundings. Like if a car drives past really fast and a child gets startled, that's affect. If they bang their head, that's affect. If they feel hunger, that's affect. Any stimulation like that. But
and this caregiver can help them make sense of it.
Absolutely. Okay. So the caregiver's primary responsibility during this time is to mirror what the child is feeling, so that they can see that their response makes sense to another human, and if it doesn't, to receive the right kind of input, and to help them regulate, difficult experience. Prime example of this was Sophia, right? Your little one at the weekend, and she banged her head. She's obviously very upset. So the first thing to do is to put her into the arms of a caregiver, make her feel like she's grounded, because the nervous system of a 2-year-old is easily overwhelmed. Obviously, it doesn't have any kind of input. It hasn't built enough strong force of containment. So the role of
you see them like hit stuff and just lash out and do stuff.
So the role of the caregiver is to provide containment, and there's way more of a physical kind of earthly sort of societal function of this, which is actually that the spirit of that person is slowly landing into the body of that child, that human, during this time. And so
where does that idea come from? Is that let's come back to
it. The answer will come when I start talking about what happens with trauma.
Okay.
So if a child experiences trauma, is basically a good definition, a good way to think about it, is just an experience that's too much to have in the moment. It's too much, too overwhelming, whatever it is. Could even be too much happiness at one point in time. And what happens is the psyche essentially is very, very clever. It decides that, okay, this nervous system, this child is about to be being overwhelmed, or about to be completely overwhelmed by this. How do we make them experience it in a safe way? Well, we chop it up. We're going to chop up this experience. And this chopping up is disassociation. And so what happens is the visual image of the experience goes somewhere in the brain, tucked away. The physical experience of the body goes somewhere in the body, but is covered by numbness. And the story or the meaning about it goes somewhere else entirely, because you cannot understand the meaning of something unless you feel it and visually see it at the same time. And so what happens is, if a child isn't regulated in a period of time, or gets a very disruptive or different narrative to that
about what happened.
Yeah. I'll give you a great example of this. So Donald Cowshed, who's just like an amazing Jungian writer who wrote this incredible book, Trauma and the Soul, he gives an example of one of his clients who, when she was 4 years old, they had, her parents had just moved to this new house in the neighborhood. They were getting to know the neighbors and so forth. And she went off and she picked this flower for her mother. It's a beautiful day outside, and she went up to her and she gave the flower to her mum, and she's super open about it. And her mum turns around and goes, "What have you done? You've picked that flower from the neighbor's garden." And she hit her and then marched her background and made her sort of apologize in tears to this neighbor for taking her flower, right? So it's an example of little t trauma, but it actually is like a very, very, very damaging experience for this child, because they've not had many formative moments yet in their life of these primal experiences. So this is a 4-year-old child extending like a really beautiful moment. You think about like the adult version of that. You think about what, you aged 19, 20, taking like a massive leap of faith to, tell someone you like them or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then and then having like the adult version of that come back, right? Someone basically, I don't know, slaps you, and then, you know, publicly shames you about the experience, right? That's the adult version, right? Which usually is absolutely horrifying. This is just like normal stuff happening to a child, right? Quote unquote normal. And so this is little t trauma, and this is an example where, okay, the child then is basically going to disassociate from an experience like that because it's too much for them to handle. And not only that, they're going to never want to repeat something like that. But the child cannot make the primary caregiver a negative force in their psyche because they're completely reliant upon them. And so what happens is they will internalize that mother's reaction into their psyche. And this is the split off part. So this is where it gets really interesting. So,
but they will internalize it how? Yeah,
please go ahead. So imagine the child is almost, it comes out of life as Christ consciousness. This is where the myth is going to come into play a bit later. It's this pure innocent child, and this was a pure innocent action that was taken, right? And so this innocence then gets desperately hampered by this experience that's just happened, right? And so this innocence cannot bear to experience a pain and a humiliation like what's just happened. And so what the psyche submerges this section of innocence into the unconscious, and then a parallel, a dark force function to keep it down there splits off and stays conscious. And this parallel dark force, this defense mechanism, this protector part, stays in place, and it becomes a shaming part that exists and stays for the rest of your life into adulthood ad infinitum. And this woman was in her 60s before she came to therapy. To then basically realize, you know, she was experiencing shame all through her life for extending gestures of love towards people that's hampering her relationship with the children, with her husband, and so on and so forth. And it seems absolutely awful, but it's an attempt by the psyche to do the most loving thing, which is split off, create this protector that then becomes a persecutor part that's beating you down, saying, don't do this, you're not good enough, you know, you should be ashamed of yourself or whatever, because that is better than the other two alternatives, which is one, re-experiencing the pain of that innocence that's just been submerged, or two, considering the idea that your mother, your primary caregiver, is mean or horrible, which is inconceivable for the psyche at that age. It just cannot be conceived of. And so this and incidents like this is essentially what then starts to submerge the innocence of the child into the unconscious. And as I said, to some degree, this happens to everybody. We all have aspects of our childhoods that are quite difficult, but in like meaningfully traumatized people, what this will then create is, you know, depression, anxiety, a deep sense of hollowness and emptiness within, and massive compensatory functions. And indeed, you know, as you know, my background's in investment banking from the early part of my life, and I often say, you know, people in that industry are pathologically traumatized. And I realized I should apply that title to myself as well, but later in life. But they're traumatized, and they've weaponized that trauma into performance. They have learned that safety, which is what they're now primarily craving, is coming in the form of money. And that's why it's so hard to leave that industry, because it's so hard to repeat the same safety that you think it's giving you, because what they're chasing so hard for in millions of pounds of bonuses every year and validation, right? Being in the Financial Times, doing these big deals. It's all the things that they didn't get in from developmental. And a lot of these people were sent away to boarding school, or the sons and daughters of like very wealthy people that just didn't have the time, didn't have the presence to be with them. And again, we come back to presence and affect management and co-regulation. And it's That's the primary thing. The funny thing is, and a lot of people ask me this, is like, oh, you can go through not very much in your childhood and come out really fucking traumatized because of not being regulated. And conversely, you can go through a shitload of dreadful stuff. But if you're in a loving, regulating family, you'll be fine. It's amazing how resilient children are. Children can survive war zones, a lot of very bad stuff, if there's like affect regulation and co-regulation and loving environment. It's pretty amazing. The power of the human spirit, but then also just what happens when you don't shepherd that human spirit properly. And yeah, what gets like really interesting is what Jung discovered is that this primal rupture that happens for people that have deep trauma, the psyche is so intelligent that you don't just lose this innocence forever, although the people that have experienced it do very much think that. I mean, and that's why it can take decades and truly harrowing amounts of suffering to experience before you go and speak to it, and the shame of not having this sense of like wholeness inside that other people have. You think that you're the wrong one because you're wrong, like you did in childhood, and it's so deep, you just can't see beyond it. But the psyche seems to bury the innocence in this kind of collective unconscious, or this deeper part of your consciousness where archetypal forces come in and protect it. And what that then gifts the traumatized person is often a very acute sensitivity and understanding, or sort of gift towards the other side, the invisible realms. And so a lot of artists that have had like profound trauma have this ability to see through to the other side. A lot of healers, shamans, Jung himself, because it forces the person who's again being unconsciously driven to wholeness, as we all are, to be unconsciously driven to trying to make sense of that pain. And if that's made sense through art, or in Jung's case through coming up with depth psychology, or in other cases through writing or through healing others, it will drive people to very, very profound depths in order to unconsciously try and gather this innocence back. But it really only really can come back through witnessing and reprocessing of these awful childhood experiences.
And like the primary experiences.
Precisely, right. And that's kind of why analysis and depth psychology works quite well, because the therapist essentially becomes the surrogate parent for a while. Now, there's problems with that, with things like transference and things like that, but if it's well held, then they can essentially be the temporary parent that you needed to witness and re-go back through these awful memories and experiences, to then allow you to reprocess them, individuate, and then not need to rely on a parent anymore. Or, you can explore these things with like MDMA therapy, or psychedelics, or that kind of thing as well, because they're so buried. The only real way to get to these things is through dreams, or things that open up and reveal the unconscious. Most people really only end up in therapy because of like profound depression or anxiety, or psychosomatic illnesses, autoimmune diseases, just really crippling levels of pain. And again, because most people's compensations to them are performative, and they become very good at it,
it gets rewarded.
You get rewarded.
Yeah.
And it really only shows up in people convincingly through interpersonal relationships. This is where the breakdown in interpersonal relationships, where people cannot, maintain long-term relationships, or they're so shielded around their children. That is where you see it, because it's going right to the heart of that caregiver aspect, because it really is the child part in you, the innocent child part in you, that loves, that is capable of deep, deep, deep love, both love of self and love of the other. And so when that's gone, that's what shows up in in relationship with traumatized people.
You had said to me when we were talking about this in the past that the opposite of love is not actually hate, it's power.
Power.
Yeah. Is that tied in with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I can share about my experience here recently, but love is an expansive feeling and experience. When we love, we seek to share, we seek to grow, and hate is not that. Hate is not the opposite. That the opposite of love is power, because power is domination and control.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I always say, like, if you love something, you should set it free.
Mm-hmm.
If you hate something, you don't want to set it free, but it's the power, you want to control it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't mind sharing about this now, but I recently had, a fairly deep dive experience into some tricky childhood memories of mine, and some kind of grievances with, my mother, and some, some very difficult parenting experiences that my brother and I were on the receiving end of. And when I was going through this kind of regression experience, using MDMA, what I realized was, and it made it easier in a way, was that my mum's behavior towards us and some of the physical violence we experienced wasn't anything to do with like an love or an absence of love. It was to do with control and power. She was a woman that was overwhelmed by the experience of mothering two young boys on her own, didn't have much money, and she didn't have any support, any family nearby. And what would happen was we would act up to some degree, just like children would, and we would reach this point where her nervous system couldn't tolerate the level of chaos going on. Because again, she's coming from a place of her own trauma, doesn't have containment, and so as we hit a level of dysregulation, and then bam, she goes into unconsciousness, right? And the first thing you want to do is just control what is going on around you. And I realized as I was regressing through these memories of like violence that it wasn't that she didn't love us. The love was, I could feel all the love still there. That was the funny thing. It was about power, and it was about oppression, and it was about control.
And what wasn't it also about her just being unable to be your primary caregiver at that moment?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. It was flipping into unconsciousness, basically. And I suddenly zoomed out, and this is the most healing aspect of it, as I came out of my personal story of the whole experience, and I suddenly saw everything as, my lineage, or even just like the lineage of modern society, of this kind of patriarchal, like, control mechanism, this power, this desire of power, this like this unwillingness to want to allow full emotional feeling, and the feminine to come out. And I suddenly saw particularly my ancestral line of just, layer after layer of generation after generation of just sort of like shut down this emotional expression, and it's scary, it's chaotic, we need to control it.
It doesn't perform.
It does, yeah. and it probably worked amazingly well for, like, back in 1850s, or when my great grandfather was a miner or something, right? And they really did have to, shut that stuff down and get on with it. So it was like an unbelievably like healing experience to finally see that, and allow me to let go of a lot and just understand a lot, and just be like, okay, this is just a lineage of like poor affect, management and regulation, and it's just about like widening the scope of the ability to deal with that.
How does this then tie in with Jung's journey back to Christ consciousness?
Well,
because as you were reading this book and you were talking about the this defense mechanism for innocence, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, and that gets amazing. So the life is going to happen, period, and shit's going to happen. Poor Sophia hit her head. These things happen, right? The child is going to experience pain. We all experience pain every single day. It's like, how's the old adage go? Pain is guaranteed. So pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional, right? And so it is inevitable that a child is going to come into this life innocent and essentially get, quote unquote, crucified by the earthly experience of life. You cannot maintain that innocence. Now, trauma is the most extreme example of where that innocence is getting submerged, but we all, to some degree, lose our childhood, and we all know that like the happiest parts of ourselves come out. This is why people like writing novels or like going back into art or trying to, when they do get depressed, go back to these places, right? Because this is where the soul really is. And so what
can I add something?
yeah.
One thing as a father, what's interesting though is that I have to both protect my daughter's innocence and also prepare her for the world at large.
And accept the fact that she will lose her innocence through events that you cannot control.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is willingly.
Despite my best,
Yeah.
despite what I try. Yeah.
Now here's where it gets beautiful and redeeming, and like the real power of the Christian myth and Christian consciousness, right? This is what's incredible, which is like we all feel betrayed by life. We all came here hoping that we were going to get on paths of gold and live out, our childhood dreams and aspirations and be as happy as we were, right? And we've all had that moment in our early 20s when we sort of graduate or whatever, go into work and be like, shit, this is what paying bills is going to be like, and renting and dealing with the shit of life. Oh, now I get why adults weren't as happy as me growing up, right? And we sort of just become that, right? And the rest of life is this sort of attempted reclamation to get back to the contentment whilst also dealing with the issues of maturation and so forth. And so and this is why trauma survivors and the reintegration of that give us such a beautiful insight into this, because what going back through trauma, and we all do this, which is micro versions, different gradations of it, like does, is basically it's the decision to consciously resubmit that deepest, most innocent, childlike part of yourself back to the pain that you couldn't experience before. So that is a conscious, as an adult,
yeah,
which is a conscious crucifixion. They always make the emphasis, right, that Christ went to the cross innocent, right, and he was nailed for other people's sins, right? And that is essentially
betrayed by those he loved.
Yeah.
And he was,
So now look at it as in what you're doing in therapy and healing, right? You are essentially gathering that most innocent part of you, taking it back, re-experiencing that pain, the crucifixion, and doing it for the sins of others and the betrayal that you experience, in order to ultimately be reborn, but reborn to a mature view that suffering, pain exists, but we can be innocent in it. Yeah. And that's the gift. That's the gift.
And is it that gift and that idea that Jung came back to when he looked at this and said, we now understand the trajectory that from a child to an adult that they can go through, that we would like them to go through, and the end of that trajectory really is the archetype of Christ and Christ consciousness. That like to get back there is
now what he did have to say about it, because he wrestled with Christianity all of his life, and he deeply wrestled with the one-sidedness of the Christian story.
What's the one-sidedness mean?
The one-sidedness is that Jesus is depicted as this all light, innocent figure, which works really well for that narrative arc we just discussed there of like essentially coming back to redeem your divine, innocent child self. But what it negates, and his big thing is the shadow, and that it doesn't look at what's actually required of you to individuate and go back into in order to become whole again. And so he saw the downfall of Christianity as a religion that only emphasized the light and the innocence and the purity of Jesus and made him a savior, while being blind to its own shadows. which is interesting when you think about it, because a lot of the shadows of the church, just in our modern times, have all been sort of, these awful like child abuse, pedophilic things, all involving children, funnily enough, and the corruption of the innocence of children by priests and pastors and so forth. So it's very interesting to see that the shadow is even there in the divine. He almost predicted that would happen, and I'm sure it was happening for centuries before. Of course, we just don't really know about it. And so, just
there is one thing I want to add on that, because I think that there is a thread in Christianity where it is taught that you should just throw your cares on Jesus.
Yes.
Throw your concerns.
Yeah.
It's very. It's not self-referential.
No, it's an abdication of personal responsibility.
But the thing, but it's the same thing with sort of New Age thought, which says that you shouldn't actually go back and amend your errors. That is also like, you don't want to focus on the dark. Like there's like they're kind of two parts of the same coin, which is like both of them. In one, you're absolving yourself by throwing it on Jesus. The other one is you're just like basically not gonna acknowledge that there is any a wrong, or that you have done something incorrectly. And I think with both of them, that will probably be what Jung gets at, which is like there is an element of action for you as an individual to integrate these things, right?
Yeah. And you're not really thinking about the unconscious harm that you're doing out of your shadow as a result of these things. When I think about aspects of my past, traumatic experiences, they sort of corrupted my innocence or whatever, as you said, story, but they've also made me behave in ways that cause harm to other people, to become sort of a bit pathological around business, and just be like very cutting towards people. And so really that reclamation of that innocence for me is not just a recognizance of that loss of innocence, but a recognizance of the harm of the lived life that I have experienced as a result of it, and the harm that I've done, the shadow of it, that dark splintering part. The unlived life is an interesting one to pull back on. And so Jung basically, he thought, he wrestled with Christianity, wrestled with this idea of it only having this pure image. He deeply disliked the idea of like the Messiah complex, of pedestaling anyone, that it was all supposed to be self-referential. It's all supposed to be about conquering ourselves, our inner demons, our shadows, and so forth. And so he wrote this amazing book called Answer to Job towards the end of his kind of professional life. And in it, he took the parable of Job, which is, for people that don't know, the story where the devil basically shows up and says, these people are only following you because you're nice to them. And God's like, no, it's not. That's not the case. And he's like, I guarantee you they'll stop following you if you started, to treat them badly. And he's like, no, I'll prove it. So he picks Job, who's his most loyal, most devoted servant, and slowly and absolutely brutally, in only sort of the Old Testament way, destroys this man's life. Takes away his animals, his farm, famine, children, I think maybe eventually his wife, pestilence, just everything basically. And so the whole parable is Job basically saying like, why God, why? And again, God just keeps handing him savage smackdowns. And I don't think he ever breaks. I don't think he breaks. I think he commits all the way through. But a lot of people look at this parable and just look at it as like Old Testament evil. Again, I think going literal with it rather than the meta piece of it. But what Jung did was basically use it to show his theory that, and it's quite something, that he believes that God is essentially unconscious of his own shadow. And that the purpose of humans and human suffering is to show God his own shadow of causing pain and suffering, and that the countering value of humanity, the countering force, is to essentially ennoble themselves through suffering and pain and make God conscious of and aware of his actions. Which is a really, it became like this very dicey idea to put out there, because obviously the Christians believe that God's omnipotent, that there isn't anything that, benevolent, right? Yeah. That it's anything they wouldn't know. But I kind of like it as an idea. I think it's a really, really, really interesting concept. It's a bit frightening.
Well, it mirrors a bit of the Greco-Roman ideas that we're here as the playthings of the gods.
Yeah. Yeah. But then it kind of elevates us, because it's like, God made man in his image.
But image of the shadow or image of the light? Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah. But we're here to play with both, right? So it's kind of a fascinating idea to sit with.
And why has all this spoken to you?
Well, I mean,
because for as long as I've known you, you've had an interest in psychology. Let's say is a very broad term for it. Myth.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would fall in the category of someone that's kind of described and spoken about a lot in sort of Donald Cowshed's book of Trauma and the Soul. I think I experienced, very, very, very difficult first few years into life in terms of this kind of affect regulation and mediation. I think that as a result, became a very performance achievement oriented person. So, when you become, financially and business successful, people aren't really pointing towards these things in you. But it became very clear to me from like my mid-20s onwards that I was just suffering from like a severe sense of hollowness and emptiness that other people weren't. And then latterly, like quite significant like intrapersonal relating difficulties with romantic partners, and like very difficult psychosomatic issues with like strong sense of disassociation and sleep issues and so forth. So, and then to Donald Cowshed's theory that like people with those kind of primal ruptures in their psyche develop a strong affinity for things beyond the mundane of life. Like you can't really get too fussed about talking about, I don't know, Love Island or whatever on the TV, as good as that is. The psyche is just like operating at a different level. It's operating because this is where I feel safe at the deeper level. And that makes a lot of sense, right? I didn't feel safe when I was 3 years old in the earthly world. So I'm kind of still stuck, if you like, swimming in this kind of mythopoetic soup. And I'm still working through this kind of affect management and mediation to kind of like rebirth into normality. So
but you had also said that you saw that show up. There was a girl that you were dating who, when she was close to you, you felt that your HRV, your heart rate variability, improved, according to your aura ring was improved, right?
For sure. Yeah. Perfect example
of that. That would be representative of what you're describing.
Yeah. And this stuff takes a really long time to both identify that you have, to not feel like incredibly ashamed of, because a lot of people with trauma have like complex relationships towards that and towards their primary caregivers about it, and then also to face the pain of actually confronting it, because it's not pleasant. It's not pleasant at all. I can tell you that. It's agonizing therapy. Like a lot of the examples in this book I was reading, people are in therapy for like 5, 6, 7 years, sometimes 2-3 times a week, going through truly horrific memories of things that were just too difficult to experience. So I have a lot of compassion for people that go through these experiences and come out the other side of it. But they also have a lot of gifts to give, which is great. And I think Jung did. I don't think Jung even realized what he was in. I mean, that's just the true bravery of him as a person, that none of this even existed before he came along. So he was truly
put words to it. Yeah.
exactly, truly in the wilderness, that man. So yeah.
Well, how do you think about Jordan Peterson's work? Because he's taken a lot of Jung's themes and concepts and expanded on them or brought them, into the 21st century for people.
Yeah, yeah, he's a complex individual. I think, funnily enough, an artist friend of mine, when he was kind of breaking through in sort of 2013, 14, 15, said something really interesting about him, which is that he said he didn't feel like he had an integrated lover archetype. And at the time I was kind of really taken by his, strength of word and kind of repopularization of a lot of these myths and so forth, and helping young men find direction, where, we're living in a society where there aren't a lot of good role models around. There aren't a lot of men, fathers around, period, because they're working quite hard. So men are mostly being raised by women, which is problematic for adolescence and beyond. Not so much in the early life. But the longer his time and tenure has gone on in the public spotlight, the more I've revisited this remark that my artist friend said, and the more I think it's true. I think that there's a deep disconnection to sensitivity and compassion in this man, and it's not that he's incapable of these things. In fact, funnily enough, you see him kind of blubbering quite a bit when people come up to him and thank him, and he becomes overwhelmed by the support and service that he's given. It's the kind of like the weaponization, I think, of some of his words and the way in which he goes after certain people. I think that there's a struggle that I have with the kind of the embodiment of Christ consciousness within it. And I find it very, 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 very interesting and very telling that a man of his intellectual accomplishment and reading has been suffering from very profound depression for several decades and has been medicating that. And for a man that studies Jung, has seen what he's done, to not see the value in descending into that depression himself and coming out the other side really points at something for me. I think that the descent is where his like Miss Lover archetype is, and I think that there's something massively awry with that. And I never ever ever judge anyone for taking antidepressants. I've taken them in my life to get through truly hellish experiences, but they're not the long-term solution. And the long-term solution is to descend into the madness and to come out and get the gifts from it. And I don't think until you do so, you're whole. And I think that you pass that on to future generations. As the Bible says, right, the sins of the father become the sins of the son.
Sevenfold.
Yeah.
7 generations.
And what do you think about him?
His early work had a very profound impact on me. And to mimic some of what you said, I kind of quit paying attention to him after I felt like I got what I needed from the first book and his early YouTube talks. And I think he diluted his own strength and brand by getting more into the
cultural commentary.
Because I think which I can understand it. I can understand why he did it. I just also think that it talking at like a philosophical level or at a moral level sort of kept him out of the fray of political or ideological battles, although it manifests itself as political and it manifests itself as ideologies. It's just that he was very pleasant to talk at like a higher level early on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I still like the guy. I mean, I still think 12 Rules for Life is an amazing book. I never read the second one. I don't know. Maybe you did. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe on that note we wrap, huh?
Sure.
bit of a down note to stop on, but I do think that if people are more interested in your journey, you did run a podcast for a while, Inner Truth.
Mm-hmm. Still on Spotify. Yeah.
Still on Spotify. That was both a writing platform and a podcast.
Yeah. And I think like if anyone is interested in the aspects we've been talking about today, I cannot recommend James Hollis enough. He's an amazing Jungian writer that he speaks truly in kind of normal parlance and with really interesting stories and thoughtful, anecdotes and fairy tales. And his book, The Middle Passage, was one of the most powerful books and impactful books I've read. Yeah, really, really helpful for anyone in their kind of midlife search for meaning. Yeah.
I did have one follow-on question since you mentioned James Hollis. So imagine you have kids. What are the stories that you would like them to read, like the fairy tales or the myths that you would willingly do you like is there certain ones that you think carry more weight, or are there ones that you think they should steer clear of Frozen?
If I've learned if I'd learned anything from my own childhood, it's not to pick, it's to allow the kids to pick.
Okay.
Yeah. Whatever they want to go with.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that I truly believe that if you operate from the mindset that you as a parent are a steward to a soul,
and this innocence,
a flower, a tree that is unfolding, and all you need to do is turn up and water it. You don't need to push your shit into it. You can, your boundaries are the kind of, you might put like a stick next to a tree, right, to help it grow up straight, and that's absolutely fine and appropriate. But allow that child's like profound curiosity to play out. And I think that if you can achieve that, then that is the gold standard, my view of great parenting.
Cool.
So let them pick the fairy tales.
So long as it's not on the phone.
Yeah.
The medium does matter.
Yeah.
In addition to the message.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, David. Appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure.
Hi again, folks. If you enjoyed the show, I've got a favor to ask. Would you mind leaving a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, or whichever platform you've been listening to this podcast on? Every one of those helps. If you didn't like the show, or if you've got feedback about it, let me know via the contact form on spreadgreatideas.org. I'd like to hear from you as far as what can be done to improve. So again, if you enjoyed the show, then please help out by spreading the word. And if you didn't, let me know how to improve it. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope you'll check out the next one. Thank you.